Hello and welcome to episode 14 of the Pollination Podcast. In today's episode, I'll be covering the problems with beginning to raise queens too early in the season. I've been wanting to make this episode for months now because I've seen it coming, but I wanted to collect a little more information from the hives before I recorded an episode just to make sure I wasn't saying something incorrect, but now I'm pretty sure. So I'm going to share with you what I found with me beginning to raise queens as early as January and the results from starting so early. So if there are any other beekeepers listening to this podcast who raise queens and sell them to the public, you'll know where I'm coming from when I say there is a tremendous pressure from people who purchase your queens to get them out the door as soon as possible. I start getting phone calls in January asking for queens, asking for nukes. It's a lot of pressure. You start seeing other beekeepers posting their nukes or their queens online. So you try to rush and do it. And inevitably, it's probably a bad thing for everyone involved. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. In the years previous, I always started my cell building program about mid-February. February 15th was always kind of my go date. Obviously, it could fluctuate by a couple weeks depending on the weather, but in my mind, February 15th is, hey, beginning of the year, let's get going. I really wanted to grow my queen breeding program this year. I really wanted to be like the premier queen breeder in my area. There are no other beekeepers around here that are selling mated queens at scale. There's a lot of guys doing queen cells. So I really wanted just to hit the market running and just sort of take over everything. And that led me to start grafting queen cells as early as January 13th. I'm an avid note taker. I think the best tool you have as a beekeeper is a pencil and a piece of paper. I write down everything, the dates, what I'm doing, the percentages, everything. I'm just going to go through my notes and read you guys some highlights of what I was seeing with my queen cell production beginning January 13th, which was a test graft, but I kept plowing through even after we did the test graft, so that was really the beginning. On January 13th, I grafted 15 larvae. Only 3 of the 15 were started. Only 1 of the 3 cells actually hatched. By the 3rd week of January, I was getting about a 50% take on my grafts, but most of the cells were not being capped in the 5-day period. I left over 500 hives back at the house that weren't really up to snuff to make grade in California, and I decided to requeen all of those hives with a queen cell. Beginning February the 5th, I went through all of these 500 plus hives, found the original queen, smashed her myself, and gave them a queen cell that I was raising. I started on February the 5th because I was seeing a large surplus of drones in the majority of the hives, and I had seeded the drones for about a week, so they should have reached sexual maturity by this point. By February the 11th, the majority of our grafts were being started, but the majority were still not being capped. Even after I was dumping in frames and frames of brood, I think most of our starters were almost solid brood, and we were dumping in tons of nurse bees on top of that. On February 12th, I was only getting 32% of my cells capped. By February 17th, 44% of my cells were being capped, but more than half of them were very small. They were probably about the size of your pinky fingernail. By March 21st, we were still getting terrible mating rates. I wrote down that the nukes that I made in mid-February, they were about 2 to 4 weeks old. Around the March 21st date, less than half of them were queen right or strong enough to be sold. I think I had about 35 out of 100 were queen right and healthy. I think around the 3rd week of March, about 3/4 of all the nukes that I had been making over the last 4 weeks turned out to be drone layers and had to be pinched and requeened. A lot of them were just outright lost because they were just so filled up with drone brood, there was just no worker population left to sustain them. So they had to just be reincorporated back into the parent colonies and resplit again. In the second half of March, I started to notice an increase in mating percentages, but we're still only talking about 50 to 70% of my queen cells were being mated, as probably the best case scenario. April is when I started to get really good mating success. I was probably getting upwards of 80%. I think as we got closer to May and into May, I was getting upwards of 90%, which is mostly what I was seeing last year a lot earlier. So this year was just really bad for mating for me. And I did have 2 drone production yards. One is a half mile up the road from me, and the other one's about 2 miles down the road from me. And there's another commercial apiary, even larger than me, about a mile down the road. So there should have been a massive surplus of drones in the area. I just finished pulling my honey, and once I got all the honey off and extracted, I've been running around and medicating and queen checking all the hives. And I try to isolate yards when the date of the queen is going to be mated. So I can say, okay, this batch of queens is bad because the entire yard is bad. That's usually how I kind of do it. That's what helps me kind of figure out what's going on. I don't like to mix different queen cells, the age of them when they're going to mate, into the same yard, because it gets very confusing. I can't calculate, like, is it the queen cell that was a problem? Was it something else? I've been going around, I queen checked almost all the hives, and basically what I've noticed is that almost all of the February cells that I put in, so this is probably when I pinch the queen, I put in a cell. I usually put the cell in about 2 days before it hatches. The majority of the February queens, and I would say the first half of the March queens, resulted in either immediate queen failure, very high supersedure rates. There were supersedure cells in almost every single hive, all over the place. Poor brood patterns, really spotty. There were entire bee yards I didn't even make a box of honey. There was one yard I didn't even make a frame of honey, and it had made honey in the past. There were a lot of hives that are really weak, and I can't do my summer splits, and I just had a very high mortality rate from those early yards. Thankfully, what I'm doing now is we've really got our queen program up and running pretty well. I've got a pretty good system in place, so I'm having mated queens come out weekly, and I'm selling most of them, but I'm trying to set aside a little bit for myself. And what I'm doing is I'm going around every day. I just take a few cages of mated queens with me, and as I come across to these yards or these bad hives, I just pinch the queen, and I give them one of these new later spring mated queens, or I guess summer now, and they're much higher quality. So I have been able to turn a lot of the hives around, and I'm going to be rebuilding, most of the ones that failed. Thankfully, we didn't really lose much comb, but I definitely lost that honey production. And instead of increasing my colony count as much as I would like in this second half of the year, I'm really just going to be trying to make up for the ones that failed. And I really attribute our main loss this year to our colony loss so far. It's to those February queen cells and those early March queen cells. It was a terrible mistake. I always make sure I write down the single biggest mistake that I make in a year, and I try to write a solution out for it so I don't repeat it next year. I have a list on my phone of all of these mistakes. And so far, this is the single greatest mistake I've made all year. Everything else has been going really well, but this was really a gut punch. So we're trying to recover from that, and we will. But it's very frustrating, and really, I'm the only one to blame. I rushed the queens out. I've never tried to do them that early. I kind of curtailed to the customer pressure and to my own pressure and my own ambition. So I just really rushed Mother Nature, basically, and she's making me pay for it. I should have seen this coming a little better as well, because I used to work for a large commercial apiary, and they run about 15,000 hives. And a few years ago, they had almost an identical problem. They used to order queen cells from Central Florida, so a little bit south of me. And the beekeepers in Central Florida can typically start at least a couple weeks earlier than us, sometimes even more so. So those guys down there were making queen cells, early February, and maybe they're having good mating success, I don't know. But what my old boss would do is he would buy the cells down there and have them delivered up here. And I just remember one year we were getting huge losses on our early splits. We were making splits in February, early March, exactly what I did here this year. And we were barely getting a 50% mating success on all the splits. We would usually put 160 splits to a location. If we walked out of there with 80 decent splits, it was a good success. I remember there were a lot of locations where we only had a 25% mating success, and those yards also were just not productive and had to be requeened. Nobody really knew exactly what was going on back then. There was a new guy at that company that was raising the cells, and he kind of took some of the blame. But seeing now what I'm seeing in my own apiary, I don't think it had anything to do with the actual guy making the cells. It's just too early. We sell a lot of first-time beekeepers their first hive at the beginning of the year. And one question I get all the time from them is, hey, how early can I start? I'm seeing some flowers bloom in January or February, or my fruit tree's blooming. I want to get hives. How soon can I get them? Well, I'll tell you, after seeing what I've seen this year in my own apiary, do not buy any queens that were mated in February or probably even the first half of March. From what I can see, you probably should wait to mate those queens, at least in my area, the second half of March. Honestly, April would be a lot better. I would say April and May queens are some of the best mated queens that I've seen. So it's just a warning to anybody else who is trying to push nature a little bit early or get started a little too soon. I just wanted to share that mistake that I made, because it's been a pretty bad mistake on my part. So just be wary of that. Be wary of when you're buying mated queens. If you're not raising them yourself, maybe ask the beekeeper, hey, when were these queens mated if you're getting started early? Maybe ask how long those nukes, have been established, and that way you can make sure the queen is laying properly and has a good pattern and mated well. It's just something to think about. I know the beginning of the year is so exciting and everyone's always ready, and I am too. And if you start too early, you'll pay the price for bad queens, bad hives, no honey crop, and you're just throwing your money and your time and your energy down the toilet. And it's also just not fair to the bees. You're not even giving them the advantage that they need if you were just to wait a few more weeks or another month. So moral of the story is, if you're buying bees from me or another beekeeper, try to be a little patient with us at the beginning of the year. It's in everyone's best self-interest. For those of us who are supplying bees to the public, we need to do a better job at instructing these new beekeepers and explain to them the advantage of just being patient. Thanks everyone for hearing me out. I just wanted to share that with you. I thought that was a pretty good bit of advice I've learned the hard way. Thank you so much for joining us today on the Pollination Podcast. I'm Matthew Walker from Walk in the Woods Apiary. We hope we have answered a few of your beekeeping and pollinator questions. Please share your questions and comments to our Facebook page at the Pollination Podcast.